Jnanatamrandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gorangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sutta Devi Pranamami Hari Priye. Jaya Shriman Narayana, Jaya Bhagavan Shri Krishna, Jaya Shri Radhe. Now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we're going to be very specifically celebrating Lord Shiva today. And I want to just give a little bit of an explanation for those who are not really conversant with Hinduism very much about what precisely this means. And before I talk about that directly, first let me explain philosophically why it is that we even celebrate Lord Shiva, who again is this small image who we have here. When we look at reality all around us, when we look at everything that is either perceivable, literally everything that we can detect with the senses, everything that's conceivable, anything that we can think of, that we can imagine, that we can hope for, everything in this world, essentially, even though there's great diversity, even though we see that things all have different names, different forms around us, essentially, everything, if we were to really break them down into their essence, they would fall into one of three categories. These three categories are: one, God, what in the Sanskrit language is called Brahman, or sometimes Narayana. Number two, those things would break down into possibly what is spirit, what is individual consciousness, each of us as an individual consciousness. What in Sanskrit is called Atman, or true self, or Shiva. And you'll see where we're heading with this. The third element, the third what is called Tattva, the third real, philosophical real, into which all things can possibly descend, is materiality, nature. What again in Sanskrit is either called Jagat, which means just materiality, unconscious materiality, or what is sometimes called Shakti. So everything that exists breaks down into one of these three things. Okay? When we look around us, what do we see? Primarily matter. In fact, truthfully speaking, being very strict with language, we only can see matter. We can't see spirit. So quite literally everything that we see around us is matter. Here, look at your neighbor. Seriously, don't be afraid. Look at your neighbor. You know what you're seeing? You're seeing matter. You're seeing a body. You're seeing a physical body that came into being, is here right now, but will go out of being. Of course, what makes this matter different from, let's say, the chair, or let's say the wall, is that this matter is animate, whereas other matter is not. This matter is animate only for one reason and one reason alone, and that is because there is the presence of consciousness within it. Now, how do we know this? Well, remove the consciousness, what will you have left? You will have a piece of dead matter. You will have a body. It's very interesting. Whenever people, kind of challenge me, more atheists, whenever they challenge me and they say, "Oh, how do you know that there's a soul? How can you prove that there's such a thing as a soul?" We very simply point out to them, well, okay, here's an experiment. Here is a dead body. Here is a living body, quote unquote. Here is a person who is alive. Okay? If you examine them, they each have the same elements. All the organs are there in the dead body, as in the living one. All the limbs, all the chemicals, everything quite literally is there. Materially speaking, nothing is missing. However, this body will get up and talk to you, this body won't. And there is no material explanation for why that is the case, and why not only will that body not get up and talk to you, but you cannot make it do so no matter what. So ultimately, when we look around, what we're seeing primarily is matter. But then there is also that other element of Atman, of consciousness. So whenever we see anything that's alive, and what is wonderful about Dharma is that it teaches that this is not only true for humans. When we see anything that is alive, not just humans, but all living beings. If we see a cat, if we see a dog, if we see a cow, indeed, if we see a tree, if we see anything that's alive, what we are seeing is consciousness. Consciousness within matter, And it's for this reason that we have to give respect and love toward all living beings, and not just human beings. Because if that being is alive, it is consciousness. Okay? Now, dealing very specifically with consciousness, when the attribute of consciousness, when the element of consciousness is personified, when you think of consciousness as a whole, this is where Shiva comes into play. What Shiva represents is quite literally the personification of consciousness. Okay? Now, this is something that's interesting that makes Hinduism, or what I more properly like to call Sanatana Dharma, very, very special. Is that Sanatana Dharma, and really all ancient spiritualities, teach that when we look at the universe around us, we are in actuality seeing a universe that is alive with personality. It's interesting. For the most part, the modern scientific worldview is such that unless something is literally moving, in other words, unless you see a human or an animal moving, anything that you're looking at is necessarily dead. Nothing is a person. When we look at the sun, what is the sun? Well, it's essentially a rock on fire floating in space, to state it simply. What is the earth? The earth is a planet floating in space with no feelings, with no emotions. It's simply an object. It's there simply for us to use. That's the modern scientific worldview. We can go on like this. When, through the eyes of science, we see a forest, what do we see? We see natural resources. We see something that's dead. Well, when we view all these very same things from a spiritual perspective, we don't see merely an object. We don't see something that's dead, that's simply there for us to use, to exploit. Rather, we see something alive. For us, the earth is a personality. For us, each tree is a personality. For us, nature is a personality. So we see quite literally a universe that is alive with personality and with consciousness. So when we think of consciousness as a whole, as a category, that can become personified in the form of Shiva. And this very specifically is who Shiva is and what Shiva represents. All right? So this is who Shiva is very specifically. Now, why do we meditate on Shiva? Why do individuals, as you're about to see, why do we do ceremonies in which we offer various things to Shiva? This is actually something very important. Again, what does Shiva represent? Shiva represents consciousness, the consciousness that we are. When we meditate on Shiva, we're not doing idol worship. We're not worshiping some strange being. In actuality, what we are doing is exercising reverence for our own consciousness, for our own spirit as spirit. Now, this may sound a little strange to people. Why would we want to do this? Well, when we think of what is the nature of consciousness, when we understand what is the nature of consciousness, this helps us to understand a little bit why it's important for us to indeed meditate upon our own consciousness. We each are ultimately this Sanskrit word that I used, Atman, true self, eternal spirit, beyond merely the body, beyond the mind, beyond the intellect, certainly beyond ego. But more than this, we are a reflection of the divine. We've all heard this in the Western world, that we are all made in God's image. Well, what does that mean practically? It means that God is our source. God is our origin. So God being our origin, we qualitatively share in God's essence. You see, we're not God. That's not what I'm saying. Not at all. Not at all. We're servants of God. However, God being our origin, everything that God contains within God, we also have to a lesser degree. So this is something truly amazing to understand and to celebrate. Because what is God? What is God ultimately? Well, that's a question we can talk about for 5 hours. But to give a 30-second answer to that, God is the source of all wonderful and good attributes, of all positive attributes. Think of anything good, think of that to quite literally an unlimited and infinite degree, and those don't even describe God, they describe the attributes of God. They describe the qualities of God. So, God is beauty, but beauty of infinite proportion. Of infinite proportion. Think of the most beautiful thing, the most beautiful person that you have ever seen in your life. Imagine that multiplied. What? A billionfold? No. Infinitely. God is the source of beauty. God is the source, similarly, of truth. God is the source of good. Not merely doing good, but good itself. And on like this. Now, this being the case, this being the nature of God, if we similarly are little sparks of the divine, if you can imagine this, it's as if God is this grand roaring fire. And you know, when you have a fire, you have sometimes little sparks that will kind of shoot off from that fire. We're like those sparks. So if these are the qualities of God, we also, in our essence, share in those qualities. So what is the nature of our consciousness? It's eternal. It's eternal. What is meant by eternal? What is meant by eternal is not merely that it came into being at some point and it will never end. But no, it literally never even came into being. It cannot but exist. That is the nature of who we are. The nature of who we are is that we are beautiful, is that we are good, is that we have wisdom, is that we have self-luminance, that we have light. We are all these things. Of course, we're not necessarily experiencing those things right now. But that's because only we choose not to. We choose not to, you know. We are all these things, but we simply suffer from spiritual amnesia. You know, when you have amnesia, you forget your true self. You forget everything of importance. You know, it's a terrible thing to have amnesia. It's like you lose your identity. You literally lose your identity. We have spiritual amnesia. This is the only reason why we feel that we're not accessing these things right now. Well, this is why we do such things. This is why we do meditation, why we do any sort of spiritual activity, is to rid ourselves of that amnesia and to quite literally remember who and what we truly are. So this is our true nature. And this is why we meditate on Shiva, because Shiva really is us. Shiva represents the grandeur of our own consciousness. It's very interesting. A little bit later, actually, we're going to do a mantra meditation where we're going to use a very specific mantra. Very simply, it's Shivoham, Shivoham. This is one of the most interesting of mantras because it's a very unique mantra. What the mantra literally means in Sanskrit is, I am Shiva. Aham means I am, and then Shiva. Shivoham, Shivoham. I am Shiva. You know, so again, what precisely does this mean? Does this mean that I am that person in that perfect lotus position like this? No, it means I am consciousness. It's a way of reminding ourselves, again, jogging that memory, that spiritual memory that's there. So this is the nature of what is Shiva, and this is the nature of what we're doing here tonight very specifically.